Robert, it's very important to remember that these are complex situations. Oftentimes, the facts of what was emerging has not been realized on a broader scale. And it's also very difficult to know exactly what is going to do more good than harm. These are not simple situations in which the silver bullet, the shot fired just in a nick of time, is going to save the day. Oftentimes, intervention has had far worse results than not intervening. It has been counterproductive, brought down a government and left chaos in its wake. We have many of those situations. So it's both in terms of these being very difficult situations, difficult to know what to do that will really help. Oftentimes it's forgotten that in fact the international community has intervened. We have peacekeeping troops already on site. For example, that was the case in Rwanda and in Srebrenica in Bosnia, but the intervening troops were too few. They didn't have the right equipment. They didn't have the right information. So even though the international community had intervened, many people remember that as a non-intervention because it was so ineffective. So I think it's very important to understand the facts of past cases when we're building policy for what will work in the future. Well, probably the three best known cases of atrocity in recent decades would be the Cambodian massacre of their own people by Pol Pot and the Rwandan massacre of Tutsis by Hutus and the massacre at Srebrenica of Bosnians by Serbs. In all three of these cases, we find that, in fact, there was military intervention, outside military intervention, that lies at the beginning of each of those tragedies. Cambodia, of course, is a terribly tragic situation, and I think that this was one in which it was not clear what was unfolding. Cambodia had been part of the end of French colonialism, had been part of the Vietnam War. The United States certainly wanted to leave that region. In fact, our history of military intervention in Vietnam, in Cambodia, had led to the weakened governmental institutions that finally collapsed in the lunacy of Pol Pot and his decision to remake that society. But at least in the case of the United States, having intervened so tragically for so many years, it certainly wasn't in the mind of American leaders to intervene again in Cambodia. So Cambodia, in my view, while many people say this was a failure of the West to intervene, it was actually a failure of having intervened once so badly that led to this final outcome. There were things that the West should have done, but I'm not convinced myself that a major Western military intervention was the right one. In fact, what did happen and what ended the killing fields of Cambodia was an invasion from the neighbor of Vietnam. And that turned out to lead to 20 years of dictatorship and tyranny. So while I think it was necessary for some military force to be used in that situation, Vietnam had a right to use force because of the provocations from Cambodia. That's when the international community should have come in and said to Vietnam, you know, there's certain ways you can use military force, but you can't take away the self-determination of the Cambodian people. This killing has to stop. Your border may be secured, but to stay on for 20 years as a controlling outside tyranny, that is yet another international crime. Rwanda and Srebrenica are also quite similar in that these were cases in which there was an inadequate intervention by the West. There were peacekeeping troops in Rwanda. Let's talk about that case first. But when Kofi Annan was head of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations at the United Nations, before he was Secretary General, he was given the job of finding a peacekeeping mission to go to Rwanda, to police a very shaky ceasefire there between the Hutus and the Tutsis. He could not find the number of troops that his experts said should be going to Rwanda. And yet he sent a far too tiny group of troops to go there. They were given the mandate of policing a ceasefire that didn't exist with far fewer troops than the experts said were needed. And then when the killing started, and it was triggered because an outside revolutionary force of Tutsis was coming back in to take power away from the ruling Hutus. When that force was coming to the country, the ruling Hutus decided that they would try to wipe out the Home Guard or people who might be friendly to this invading group. And when that killing began at the call of the Hutu leaders, this tiny group of UN blue helmets couldn't do anything about it. So they were pulled out. And that, of course, was the wrong move at that time. Many people say if we had then sent lots of troops in, but frankly, what we should have done was the right thing from the beginning, and that was either to send the right number of peacekeeping troops in the right conditions with a real ceasefire, or not to have sent troops at all and given people the false sense of security that they were going to be protected by the UN, and they weren't. Yes, I definitely think there is. And I would just add the third one we've been talking about, Srebrenica, follows a very similar pattern to Rwanda. A small UN peacekeeping troop sent there, told people that if they would come to the safe area in and around Srebrenica, the UN would keep them safe. But there weren't enough UN troops. We always knew there were not enough. They had no means to keep people safe if the Serbs were going to start counterattacking, which they did. So as I analyze all three cases, we see the use of military force wrongly as at the start of each of these tragedies. So now when I hear people say, well, under the responsibility to protect, in situations of extreme emergency, we should send outside military forces into these situations. And I say, wait a minute. That's what caused the problems in all three of these very tragic situations. Isn't there something else we should be doing? Aren't there means, for example, can't we send negotiators to help build a ceasefire? That's what worked to prevent a catastrophe in Kenya. Negotiators went to Kenya after the elections when violence was beginning and before it spun out of control. They were able to get people talking, and all the credit goes to Kofi Annan for doing that. If outside military force had come in and then people were encouraged to start fighting each other, those protected by outside troops and those not, I think Kenya would have disintegrated into a real civil war. I would say the same about Burma, for example. There were calls to send a military invading force into Burma when the junta, after the natural disaster in 2008, was being reluctant to allow foreign aid workers in. And some proponents of R2P said, we've got to send military force. This is an occasion for R2P to be put to work. It was the foreign minister of France, Kouchner, who's been a major proponent of R2P, as well as many Canadian leaders who had been behind the original R2P concept. They were actually calling for military force to force humanitarian assistance into Burma. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. Negotiators were sent from the UN. They worked with the junta. They understood what their concerns were, and a plan was worked out so that aid could come in, and aid did flow in, and there was not a loss of lives as a result of military intervention. Which, Robert, I have to say, I think this is so often forgotten by people who want to see robust action in response to atrocities. The military weapon, the use of the military, which I know very, very well, is a blunt instrument. It is not a fine-tuned diplomatic tool the way negotiation or mediation is. When you send a military force, people are going to die. And while some people say, well, yes, some innocents will have to die so that others may live, I find that a very, very hard price to pay for these kinds of situations when I'm confident and we have the cases that show other means work better. Well, in principle, in the way that the recent documents on responsibility to protect describe it, we have to all be in favor of it. States do have a responsibility to protect their people. They have an obligation not to commit genocide, not to commit crimes against humanity. And the entire world has a responsibility to ensure that every member of the international state system does not perpetrate such crimes. Where I have some very serious concerns with the concept is that from the beginning, when it was first developed in Canada in 2001, it was designed to be a an apology for, or it argues at its heart that we should, in some cases, use military force in major humanitarian crises. It was, after all, written in response to NATO's use of force in the Kosovo crisis. Well, I thought that crisis alone would have taught us that the use of military force in complex human rights situations is almost never the right answer. You kill people using military force, and if you're trying to save and protect the human rights of some and end up killing others and civilians, innocent people who do not deserve to die, then where's your net advance in terms of human rights? How have you enhanced human rights? Especially because the R2P concept, the original document published in 2001, December 2001, and even the most recent report by the Secretary General allow, in some cases, for the use of military force in violation of international law. That is a self-contradictory and a self-defeating part of this R2P concept. Human rights, Robert, come from international law. We understand what human rights are. We promote them on the strength that they are from treaties, that they are from rules of customary international law enforced by the World Court. They are part and parcel of international law. So if trying to support this area of international law, we allow violations of other areas of international law, we end up undermining this whole important normative area, and we end up with less, not more, at the end of the day. So if we really want to support human rights, we should be saying, let's support international law in general, and let's support what I consider to be the most important principle of international law, and that's the law against war. Human rights are incredibly important, but they will never flourish for people who are living in a state of war. The UN Charter, the most basic document in all of international law, says that states are prohibited from using force, except in self-defense. And yet the R2P doctrine says, well, okay, you should not generally use force, but in some cases, if you, leader of country A, you, President Bush, you, Prime Minister Blair, if you think the human rights situation is so extreme, then you can decide to use military force. Well, that's against international law. And if we're allowing that, we risk undermining all of international law, including human rights. Well, I understand exactly what Mr. D'Scoto is talking about. The use of military force in history has been used to conquer other countries, to take power, to project military might. And that's why we outlawed the use of war for national policy in the UN Charter. In recent cases, for example, the use of force in Iraq by the United States, many people saw as just an attempt by powerful states to control a country that they didn't like and that had a lot of oil. So once you start opening up this prohibition on the use of force, I think we have to be very concerned that it will be abused by those who will say, well, we're just invading Iraq because Saddam Hussein is a tyrant. And that example of Iraq is, I'm sure, what Mr. D'Scoto was thinking of, and it is a very serious concern. Well, yeah, it's particularly worrying. African states, many of them are in a tough moment in their history in terms of nation building, and they have many issues to work out in terms of how they'll build governmental structures for them, and there has been a good deal of violence, much of it probably left over from colonial times when people had to take up arms to fight for their freedom. So there is still a tendency to use violence. People are very desperate to get power, to get access to resources. In this kind of situation, I think it's been exactly the wrong answer to call for outside military intervention in Africa, in these countries that are experiencing these kinds of upheavals and nation building. First of all, it just exacerbates this idea that using military force is okay. it gives rebels a sense, or people who are unhappy with their government, the sense of permission that they can take up arms to fight for what they want. See, it's okay, it's an R2P, it's in this document from the UN. So that's a very serious concern of mine. On the other hand, we don't have any examples where outside military intervention has worked. We don't have examples where military intervention in these kinds of complex state-building, human rights, crisis situations has been positive. Outside military intervention in Sierra Leone and Liberia exacerbated conflicts that led to 10, 12 years of civil war following the interventions. So it's a particular tragedy that people are calling for and have been using outside military intervention in African crises. Well, they're looking at a very odd set of qualifications for success. Many years of civil war, many people killed and maimed. These are both countries that are still very fragile, weak economies. Was this necessary? Wasn't there a way that that country could have developed and worked out its problems as we see Kenya is today? Ghana has had problems. They've had military coups. They did not have a civil war. They did not have outside intervention. So to encourage nonviolent ways of working out problems has led to success. I don't count what happened after the interventions in Sierra Leone and Liberia as a success at all. Let's talk about Somalia for a moment, because Somalia has had such terrible suffering for so long, much of it caused by outside military intervention. In 2006, the United States encouraged Ethiopia to invade Somalia and bring down the government that was there, the de facto government. Not a great government, but it was a government. Trash was being collected, there was some order, we didn't have the spate of piracy off the shores, we didn't have aid workers being killed regularly. It wasn't a great situation, but it is so much worse since Ethiopia invaded with the quasi-permission of the UN and with the full support of the United States. That was a recipe for disaster, and the disaster is still playing itself out. Fortunately, there hasn't been a similar kind of invasion in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a tragic situation. Mr. Mugabe should not be the leader of that country, but it's not for outsiders to determine that. Right now, Zimbabwe is in a struggle with local leaders, with Zimbabweans, for how to rule their own country. They're getting assistance from their neighbors who are mediating. The South African leaders have been very helpful in bringing that situation forward. For that tragic situation to be the site of outside military intervention, as some have called for, throwing it into an all-out civil war, how will that help? It will only make it worse. So, and that brings us to the place in Africa where we hear most often from the West that we shouldn't have intervention. And that place is Sudan. But if anyone knows the facts of Sudan, why there has been violence and killing in Darfur, they would hesitate to say there should be a major outside military intervention in that country. This was a conflict that began over land rights, over water rights. There was an idea that people in Darfur could get as good a relationship or as good a deal with Khartoum as the people in southern Sudan got, and they took up arms. They were encouraged, perhaps, by the Kosovo rebels who got the help of NATO, or others who have said, yes, let's use military force to help these people fight. At any rate, there are some 21 militia groups now in Darfur fighting against the central government. How will we help that situation by sending a military force? There is a military force there. We have sent one. Too small, out enough equipment, very concerned about having enough water. This is a situation where all of the world's resources in terms of mediation skill, negotiation skill, should be front and center until a ceasefire is worked out and we can then really help in the way we know how that actually works. Well, First of all, I am an international lawyer, and I understand the rules that the world has developed over 300 years, 350 years. We finally have a rule against using military force, asking that peace prevail. There is no right under the UN Charter or in international law for outside powers to use military force against Iran today. So that's the number one. Even if there was some right, I guess this would be about bombing nuclear weapons sites or presumed nuclear weapons sites, it would be ineffective. All military experts say that we would do very little to slow down a nuclear program that Iran might have through bombing. International law also says if military force is going to do more harm than good or not accomplish the military objective, it is unlawful to resort to it. But let me add a third reason why military force would be the wrong answer with respect to Iran. We have a vibrant movement in Iran right now following the elections. Once again, people have taken to the streets to protest against a government that they don't like. If outsiders start bombing their country, the same thing will happen as happened when we started bombing over Kosovo. People who were against Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia turned back to him because their country was being bombed. That will happen in Iran. It will slow down, if not kill, the nascent movement for democracy, for human rights in Iran. And I would rue the day that any Western country would take that step. When we're talking about responsibility to protect, it's certainly the case that we all can do more for situations of human rights violation, and we should. But we should do what works. And what works is negotiation, diplomacy. We've had some wonderful diplomats who've gone to situations of crisis and really made them better. Kofi Annan in Kenya in recent years, Sergio de Mello, who went to Mozambique and helped stop a civil war there using peaceful means, remembering that at the heart of the UN Charter is the responsibility to peace.